Hi, I'm Rachel and I'm here to do my rather belated President's Day weekend and surrounding week reading update. I spent so much of the last 3 days reading, I couldn't actually get to uploading this. I have a lot to talk about, don't know how long this will take, so I'll start with these three, because I won't say much here. These are three literary magazines / anthologies, Beach Life, District Lines, and Free State Review. I did a whole video about reading the short stories in these, and I'll link that below. And also, disclaimer, my own short story was published in District Lines. But now to backtrack a fair bit, there was a book that I forgot entirely to mention last week at my AM reading. It was an audiobook that I listened to called LEIA, the Princess of Alderaan by Claudia Gray. This is the first YA book, Star Wars Expanded Universe book that I've ever read. I read a lot of them, I guess, marketed for adults when I was a teenager, and ever since the new movies came out, most of them have been invalidated. But this one takes the new movies into account, and also the prequels into account, which as one of the 5% of people in the world who likes the prequels, I've really enjoyed. It really felt like part of a piece. And the Leia's story really fit well into the general YA heroine story of today, I think. A young girl trying to find her way in a tumultuous time because as she was a young teenager, of course, it was in the waning days of the Imperial Senate and during the height of Emperor Palpatine's power. And I think the fact that her story was part of a larger universe really helped it out, because Gray didn't have to do as much hand-holding. And also the fact that we know that the Star Wars universe is bigger than Leia means that she didn't come off as too grandstanding, but she got enough of play. It was really her own Bildungsroman, the way that the movies were really Luke's Bildungsroman, where she got to question her parents' political allegiances and come into her own power. And I really liked that her own power had to do with politics. Speaking as one of the only people who didn't roll their eyes at taxation of trade routes in the Phantom Menace scroll. I really loved seeing the Imperial Senate and the young legislator group that Leia was a part of. And really, I think one of the things this novel did for me was that it made Alderaan and the Organas into a real place and real people, and I, in retrospect, feel much more depressed about what happened to Alderaan in the first movie in 1977. So, you know, it's YA and a little simple in areas, but for people who like the style and like the story, I really think this gives Leia a special something and more character development that she was really able to get in any of her movies, personally, I think. And an added bonus of listening to it on audio is that they put in a lot of sound effects and a lot of music from the Star Wars universe. So continuing in the vein of YA prequels that make me rethink the originals, here's Tempests and Slaughter by Tamora Pierce, the long-awaited start of the Numair Chronicles that gives the backstory to one of the most famous of Tamora Pierce's Tortall characters, who she introduced in the mid-90s, I believe. Or, well, I mostly remember him from the Immortals series because that's my favorite series and what I read as a teenager. So even though this is modern-day YA, I have a lot of my actual teen feelings mixing up into this. This chronicles Aram Draper, who was Numair as a child. He is a boy with a humongous gift. That's a magic gift, and he's in a school for mages, and he moves up the ranks really quickly. And I guess I technically should be more okay with it than I was, because even in his adult years he's supposed to be uber powerful, but I don't know, it kind of came off as Gary Stewish. A lot of the beginning of the novel of him just, you know, being awesome at everything and advancing, I'm like, I don't know. I think in terms of pacing, I mean, I kind of wish that this novel was shorter, like the novels from the mid-90s. I think it dragged a little bit in the beginning, and that's a bit of a shame, I guess, because, you know, I came into this curious because I know the characters, I know a little bit about the world. I don't know how interested outsiders would be to jump into this, but for those of us who grew up with the characters from Tortall, I think this is a great start to something, because we are also introduced to Emperor Orzorn when he was a child, or a teenager, before his ascent to the throne was even all that definite, and also to Varys Kingsford, who was in his court and was Aram Draper's former lover. Well, it's just starting to happen at the end of this book, which spans from about the time that Aram was 10 to 14. And it takes place all in Carthage, where most of the other books take place in Tortall. So, yeah, this is giving me a nice new look at Carthage, and more importantly, it gives me a new look at Orzorn and Varys, who, spoiler alert for the 90s books, they were kind of the bad guys, especially Orzorn. But here, they're the good guys, or at least they're much more muddled and much more empathetic, and so they've really made me rethink these characters who for like 25 years I thought I had a handle on. So yeah, I really think this book is worth it. I think Tamora Pierce introduces political and moral quandaries. I think what Orzorn is going through is particularly fascinating, and I have a soft spot for Varys. Maybe I wouldn't have had it as a teenager, but I'm much more aware now of how people belittle feminine traits, and that even goes, Varys even experiences and talks about that a bit in the book, like her magic focuses so much on like the kitchen and stuff like that, and people call her like a hedge witch, and it seems so belittling, you know, in that sexist way, and I think that's something I would have thought made her shallow when I was a teenager myself, but now I see her with more dimension. She's somebody who is able to smooth things over diplomatically and knows her way around a kitchen with potions and all of that, and that's a good thing. And anyway, you know, the plot and the drama got a bit, you know, heavier at the end, so, you know, it's definitely drawing me into the second book, which I assume will be out a lot quicker than this book came out. I've been waiting for it personally 5 years. More people have been waiting longer. And finally, on a YA fantasy trifecta, I'll go into an urban fantasy book that I listened to on audio recently. It's the second of the Monsters of Verity duology, A Dark Duet by Victoria Schwab, which, by the way, is on the BookTube SFF Awards shortlist for YA fiction, along with what I voted for, Laini Taylor's Strange the Dreamer, which, after listening to this book, I still am gunning for Strange the Dreamer, frankly. I feel like in terms of world building, there's a lot to be desired in Schwab's world, and in a way it's even less compelling to me than the first book, because a lot of the human bad guys have been vanquished and the monsters are now in control, but this certain sect of monsters who are in control are just completely evil, you know, and so, you know, there's just no nuance there, you know. I think there is something to be said for the main characters, for Kate and August, who do get in a romantic relationship, but one that I can put my feelings behind because it was well developed. And I think Schwab has a lot of interesting things to say about how they're battling their own fears and angers and senses of monstrousness, which I think kind of goes into an allegory about... I was thinking about how the story is kind of, you know, an allegory for how we see a lot of monstrousness in the real world, and as teenagers and even as adults, we question how best to confront it, and it's not going to be with this amount of kick-assery in the real world for the most part, but, you know, that's what fantasy is. It's supposed to be larger than life in that way. And I particularly like that there was one huge moral conundrum. Another type of monster, the Sunai, were kind of put on the earth to eat people's souls, and they focus on people who have killed. And so the question becomes, killing people is wrong. And it's nice to know that every act of killing someone has some sort of consequence. One of the consequences is that they make more of the Malachi monsters. Every killing makes a Malachi monster. But then some of the Sunayan humans get to debate, like, are all killings the same? Like, is it the same to, like, be an unrepentant killer than to, feel bad about it later, or to have made a mistake in the moment? So I'm always a big fan of moral quandaries and when things aren't black and white. And there was enough room in that in this series for me to appreciate it. But overall, I just wasn't all that compelled by this sort of mobster violence everywhere and the bodies piling up. I read books with violence in them, but in some books, it feels like the violence serves a purpose and you're still supposed to feel emotionally invested or have a reaction to it. But in this one, there's so many bodies of people we don't know or care about that it starts to feel like, violence porn. And I tend to just sort of have an automatic aversion to that. I don't want to just look at violence unquestioningly. So I feel like this series is not necessarily completely for me, but there was enough human drama and enough moral quandary for me to appreciate the experience of listening to the 2 audiobooks. Okay, so this is the reason I couldn't film last night, because I spent all of yesterday trying to get through this book and getting through it at the tip end of the night. And I did actually listen to LibriVox while I was reading this. This is Jacob's Room, Virginia Woolf's 3rd novel. It is a novel relatively short. It's like 155 pages, although the type in this is relatively small too. And it's sort of fleeting life portraits of the main character, Jacob, except he's mostly seen through other people, or sometimes Virginia Woolf just transfers completely to other people, thinking about their own lives, and it has nothing at all to do with Jacob. So we are deep into stream of consciousness modernist world, where Woolf really wanted to get away from the confines of the normal novel and the extreme focus on character in a traditional way. In fact, the book is called Jacob's Room because, you're supposed to see Jacob in his room, and that's supposed to be like the crux of the novel, but actually we rarely ever see the room. He's usually out and about, and we're usually out and about in the heads of the people around him. And I guess I think it was a little much for me. I mean, I was talking in my Goodreads review about when I first started reading Virginia Woolf, I loved the idea that she wanted to get away from the confines of the traditional novel because, real life is not a sitcom. We don't have a plot that begins and ends in one place, except, I guess, for birth to death to a degree, but even that has no rhyme or reason to it for most of the time. I mean, nobody would publish a 50,000-page novel of your life. So this one is about these just fleeting moments, and most of the scenes are completely in media res, and the moments in them are completely forgettable, and that's why it took so long to read, because, you didn't have much of an anchor. You just start into someone's conversation, and they're mostly just thinking about the ordinary stuff. I mean, there were some themes that cropped up. I mean, this book takes place around the time of the end of the 19th century and coming up into World War I. So there's a little bit of talk about politics, about the British Empire, about the question of self-governance in India and Ireland. I mean, that's stuff that stuck out to me because it would be of most interest to me. She also, Woolf name drops a whole bunch of people, historical and literary people, all the time. There's a big thread in here about the Greeks versus Shakespeare, and Jacob does go to Greece to look at the ruins. And there's also a lot about Woolf's feelings about women's exclusion from academia and from literary canon. She spends a lot of time in Cambridge and talks about how women were seen as less than in the academic institutions. She has one of Jacob's friends, his sister, is writing in her diary, and she only gets so much space in which to write. Hint, hint, a woman only getting so much space to write. And another woman who's in a library with Jacob is waiting for her books. I mean, they're not coming to her quickly, and she has to study statistics to get a academic job because there's just not enough room for her in some in literature and arts, or at the very least, you know, she's noting how there are not a lot of women who have been accepted into Western literary canon. So, you know, there's a dearth. There's a dearth for women, and I think Woolf is still percolating on her thoughts in this novel with that. And one of the, not final things this novel is about, it's about so many things, that's exhausting. But Jacob's life, I think, transcribes loosely to Virginia's brother's life, who he also died young, because this novel does actually end with Jacob's death after he returns from Greece. And so I think it has a feeling of a young man going out into the world and trying to understand the world through literature and the arts, you know, the big, lofty, important ideas, but he's cut down. He's cut down too soon. And also the lurid descriptions are beautiful lurid descriptions, and I think I'm still stuck on this storm from the first chapter and how Woolf described it with like the rain lashing against windows and turning silver in the light. And that image has stuck with me the whole time. And so, yeah, I'm glad I read it, and I'm particularly glad I read a version with notes in the back, which helped me to understand things more fully. But I think I want something with more concrete characters. Like, you know, with Mrs. Dalloway or Lily Briscoe, it seems like she returned a little bit to something more conventional, where it's okay for a character to exist more fully in place and time, even if we're mostly in people's heads about it. Here it's like Jacob's a wisp, you know, we're mostly seeing him from the outside. Anyway, from there I can move on to my next Virginia Woolf novel, Orlando. I mean, this is the next one that I haven't read anyway. I believe this is a relatively famous novel for her. It is based on her relationship with Vita Sackville West, where Orlando is the character who is Sackville West, and throughout the ages is either a man or a woman, given the time period. My shallow understanding through some research is that Sackville West occasionally thought of herself in feminine terms and sometimes in masculine terms, not, you know, in a transgender sort of way, or certainly not how we'd understand it today, but certainly something was there that was more gender fluid than was the norm of the time. And anyway, something I discovered as I was, you know, looking up stuff about this book is that apparently in the UK, they're filming or in post-production of a film about Virginia and Sackville West's relationship, which I'm really hoping that that film will be available in the US and not just across the pond. But anyway, let me read from the back about this book. As his tale begins, Orlando is a passionate young nobleman whose days are spent in rowdy revelry, filled with the colorful delights of Queen Elizabeth's court. By the close, he will have transformed into a modern 36-year-old woman, and 3 centuries will have passed. Orlando will witness the making of history from its edge, dressing in flamboyant fashions of each day, following the passing customs and socializing with celebrated artists and writers. Orlando's journey will also be an internal one. He is an impulsive poet who learns patience and manners of the heart, and a woman who knows what it is to be a man. Virginia Woolf's most unusual and fantastic creation, Orlando is a funny, exuberant romp through history that examines the true nature of sexuality. So I'm going to go into this with higher hopes because, again, I feel like this is going to be a bit of a firmer character that won't be quite so wispy and unattainable, so that we'll still get that those wonderful insights into to sexuality and also into the human thoughts and how they, you know, the internal mind, but hopefully the character will feel more real. And finally, I just started this book today as I return to work. This is Young Jane Young by Gabrielle Zevin. It is a book that I picked up to be part of my Jewish fiction published in 2017 list. it's also something I was just really intrigued to read. I think I'll read from the flap. Aviva Grossman, an ambitious congressional intern in Florida, makes the mistake of having an affair with her married boss. When the affair comes to light, the popular congressman doesn't take the fall, but Aviva does, and her life is over before it hardly begins. Slut-shamed, she becomes a late-night talk show punchline, anathema to politics. She sees no way out but to change her name and to move to a remote town in Maine. This time, she tries to be smarter about her life and strives to raise her daughter, Ruby, to be strong and confident. But when, at the urging of others, Aviva decides to run for public office, that long-ago mistake trails her via the internet and catches up, an inescapable scarlet A. In the digital age, the past is never, ever truly past, and it's only a matter of time until Ruby finds out who her mother was, and is forced to reconcile that person with the one she knows. Young Jane Young is a smart, funny, serious, and moving novel about the myriad of ways in which roles are still circumscribed for women, whether they are young and ambitious interns, mothers attempting to steer their daughters through a male-dominated world, political wives facing an age-old knowledge that fidelity isn't always honored, or young girls feeling bold about their many choices before they realize the gender restrictions all around them. Gabrielle Zevin captures not only the double standards alive and well in every aspect of life for women, but also the mood of our highly charged political season. You know, one fascinating thing about this, I think, is that this was only published like under a year ago, but it was before the Me Too movement and the hyper-focus on how powerful men have been getting away with sexual harassment. And so I have a feeling that even now, so soon after this book was published, things would have been different, because this book certainly goes into how indeed Aviva's life is ruined, even though she's only part of the affair, and also the younger, more impressionable person versus the powerful congressman. I've read through several chapters so far, and you know, it's very sort of on the surface. I mean, there's depth to it, but the narrative moves at a fast clip. There's a lot of humor in it, and there's a lot of examples of women in the dating world and in other places not really being taken seriously and sort of being belittled. And this is a book that goes between perspectives. I've read all of Aviva's mother's perspective, where she recounts what happened with her daughter, and then also where she is now. And now I think I'm in Aviva's perspective under her new name, Jane. And then there'll be other perspectives after this. And I'm still counting it as a Jewish fiction because, you know, in the first few chapters you couldn't go a page without having a few Jewish associations thrown at you. You know, it's one of those things where I guess I should be nervous, you know, the Gentiles are looking at us. Because obviously, you know, extramarital affairs and political scandal and all of that are not Jewish issues. I mean, it's just that the community that this is born out of happens to be a Jewish one. So there is a certain Jewish flavor to how things go down. But, or how things are, because it's really more about how things are reacted to than what happens. And I think I'm really going to enjoy this. I think it's going to, and I think it's definitely going to be thoughtful and thought-provoking. And I do wonder if I'll feel a little more optimistic at the end of this, because, you know, obviously harassment and entitlement aren't going anywhere, but it seems like public perception is a little more critical of men who take advantage in that way, and that men who did what this congressman did with a young intern wouldn't be able to get off quite so scot-free anymore. One could hope. So that about covers it for me. I feel like every time I sit down to film these, I feel like I won't have much to say, and then I end up rambling and rambling and rambling. And I hope something I said is coherent and thoughtful. I guess we'll just have to see. For now, I have a lot of editing to do, but I think I'll be back sometime later in the week because Will from Ernest Lee Eston tagged me in the Small Booktuber tag, so maybe I'll get on that. So thanks so much for watching, everyone, and I'll see you next time.